Okay, hello, good evening, everyone. And it's a great pleasure and honor for me to have with us in this IPT Talk Series Professor Peter Adamson. And just a few words, Peter Adamson is a professor of late ancient and Arabic philosophy at MLU Munich. He's the author of Al-Kindi and Al-Razi, the series Great Medieval Thinkers from Oxford University Press, and has edited and co-edited many books, including the Cambridge Companion to Arabic Philosophy and the written Avicenna Critical Essays. He is also the host, and I can say highly recommended, History of Philosophy podcast, which appears as a series of books with Oxford University Press. And today, the talk is titled Traveling Without Moving, Spatial Metaphors of Epistemology in the Islamic World. Peter, thank you once again for accepting our invitation to speak to the Institute here, and the stage is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Janice, for inviting me. It's nice to see everyone here, especially some familiar faces, or I actually can't see their faces, but familiar names like Hani and Demetrius and Georgios. Hello. So this is actually a paper that I gave in Italy a couple of months ago. So this is, I guess, my paper for Southern Europe this winter. And I was asked to write it for an event that was about the concept of journeys in medieval culture. And I was thinking, well, I don't really work on journeys because I'm a philosopher. So there were papers on things like, travelogues and whatever. And I thought, but actually there is something that I could talk about, which I'm kind of interested in, which is the idea that thinking is a kind of moving in some sense. And if you know your Plato, which a lot of you will, then you'll remember that the idea that thought is motion is something that we already find in the Timaeus. So in particular, you might remember that there's this idea that you're trying to bring the motions of your soul, and here you could almost imagine that like your rational soul is in your head, and the motions of the soul should be imitating the motions of the cosmos, like the heavenly motions. I think I'm actually particularly good for illustrating this idea because my head looks a lot like the cosmos because it's almost perfectly round and it's nice and shiny and smooth. Actually, Georgios is also a very good illustration of this. In fact, you don't even have a beard, so everyone look at Georgios. So the idea is that you have these circular motions in Georgios's head, and because he's a philosopher, they're being aligned with the motions of the cosmos, right? In general, the different parts of the soul, according to Plato, have motions. So also in the lower motions, and when these motions become disturbed, that leads to various kinds of physical and psychological illness. So he says in the Timaeus, the motions that have an affinity to the divine part within us, so the divine rational soul, are the thoughts and revolutions of the universe. We should redirect the revolutions in our heads that were thrown off course at our birth by coming to learn the harmonies and revolutions of the universe, and so bring into conformity with its objects our faculty of understanding. Now, as with a lot of features in the Timaeus, you might well wonder whether this is supposed to be some kind of metaphor, like how seriously are we supposed to take this? But the fact that he explicitly mentions that the gods don't move suggests to me that he means this seriously. So the gods don't move, the heavens move, and we're subordinate to the heavens, right? So just as the heavens are the divine part of the physical cosmos, so the rational soul is the divine part of the soul, and just as the heavens move, so the rational soul moves. And of course, there's other material in early Platonism that would make you think that the soul, in some sense, moves. For example, the idea in the Old Academy that the soul is a self-moving number, or the idea in the Phaedrus and the Laws, Book 10, that the soul is somehow the source of motion, right? Maybe it moves and then moves other things with it. So I suggest taking this literally, although of course what it means to take it literally is not so clear, right? So probably we shouldn't imagine something like just, a bit of something in your head moving from over here to over here, but it could be a fairly physical phenomenon that's being described. Now, someone else who I think took this seriously is Aristotle, because Aristotle is very interested in the question of what counts as emotion. And of course, the Greek word for emotion, I don't have to tell you, is kinesis. So he's very interested in the question of what counts as a kinesis and what doesn't. And as you know, he contrasts kinesis to energeia, right? So a kinesis would be either a spatial motion, like let's say a journey from Munich to Athens by plane, or more slowly by horse. And it's defined by its starting and end point, and it elapses gradually, right? So you only arrive at the end point of the motion once the motion is over. That's quite distinctive of a kinesis. So it sort of destroys itself in being completed, would be one way of thinking about this. Because as soon as you're there, as soon as you arrive, the motion's done. Kinesis would also describe, or the word kinesis could also be ascribed to other changes, for example, growing and shrinking, or changing color, for example. So changing from, let's say, green leaves to yellow leaves in autumn would be a similar kind of change. Whereas an energeia, an activity or an actuality, is complete while it's happening. So as you're watching the screen now, your eyesight is complete, right? So you're not sort of working on seeing the screen. And once you're done seeing the screen, you will stop seeing it the way that would happen if you were moving spatially. Rather, you're seeing the screen completely all the time that you're doing it. It doesn't matter how long you do it, right? It doesn't elapse over time. So here's a passage in which he describes this. Of these processes, we must call the one set movements, the other actuality. For every movement is incomplete, and he gives some examples. For it's not true that at the same time we are walking and have walked, or are building and have built, or are coming to be and have come to be. The different thing that is being moved and has been moved, that is moving and has moved, but it's the same thing that at the same time has seen and is seeing, or is thinking and has thought. So the latter is actuality, the former is a movement. So notice that what he's doing here is he's using a kind of grammatical test. So he's using the perfect of the verb in Greek to capture this. So in the case of an energeia, whenever you're doing it, you already have done it. So with seeing or thinking, whenever you're seeing or thinking, you have already been seeing or thinking. You're already done doing it, even as you continue to do it. Whereas you can't say that while you're traveling or turning color, you already have traveled or have turned color, right? And I think that Aristotle was really interested in the question, maybe because of Plato, who's very interested in the question of whether thinking is a kind of kinesis. So he says that, he says in On the Soul, interestingly, that fantasia is a kind of motion. Don't really know what to make of that. But unlike fantasia, thinking is not a motion. So motion is incomplete, as he says again here, whereas thinking is activity in the unqualified sense, that is, of what has been perfected. So the basic picture here in Aristotle is Plato was wrong. Thinking is not a kind of motion, it's not an example of motion. Thinking it is an energeia. But, problem, sometimes he seems to suggest that thinking is somehow connected to time. And even that you can think more quickly and more slowly, which sounds like thinking would be a kind of motion, right? So for example, he says in the physics famous line, time does not exist without change, for when the state of our minds doesn't change, we don't think that time has elapsed. Okay, so there, and the word for change there is kinesis. He also says that sometimes we think in an undivided time, which suggests that sometimes we don't, in 3.6. And more importantly for our purposes today, in the posterior analytics, he says, he's talking about the skill of seeing the middle, of spotting the middle term that completes a syllogism, which he calls ankinoia, which people sometimes translate as acumen. And he says that this happens in an imperceptible time, in askeptochrono, which is a little bit of time. It's not no time at all, right? So, for example, if someone is thinking about why is the moon illuminated and it's illuminated in the direction of the sun, then the middle term would be, oh, well, it's because the sun is shining on it, right? So you see the connection. I'll give it a better example of this later. And he seems to be saying here that when you grasp it, you don't grasp it with no time passing at all, but rather with a little bit of time passing. So, I mean, if this were a paper on Aristotle, I would now get into this question more deeply, like, what does he actually think about this? Does he actually think that time is involved in thinking or not? But the general picture is that whereas Plato thinks that thinking involves time because it's motion, apparently he thinks that. And if you, again, think about the comparison to the heavenly rotation, that obviously involves time, right? So it looks like for Plato, thinking is a temporal moving process. For Aristotle, basically it's not, but then there's some little bits of evidence that maybe it is in some sense. So that makes it really interesting. And now Demetrius will get excited because we're getting to Plotinus, but only briefly, so don't get too excited. In Neoplatonism, this is kind of resolved in the direction of Aristotle rather than Plato, because the Neoplatonists, beginning with Plotinus, recognize two kinds of thinking, namely dianoia and noesis. And noesis is real thinking, whereas dianoia is just spelling out the content of what nous does. And dianoia is subject to time and thus is comparable to motion, but noesis isn't. So noesis, as he says, is eternal in the sense of atemporally eternal. And so proper thinking for a Neoplatonist actually turns out to be thinking in the way that Aristotle described in most of the times that he talks about what thinking is. In other words, it's an energeia, it's not a kinesis. So this is actually a really interesting case of the Neoplatonists siding with Aristotle over Plato, in a sense. But of course, they would say, well, but there's still dianoia. So when Plato talks about thinking involving motion or lapsing in time, or suggests that in the Timaeus, he must be talking about dianoia. And that's okay, because what he's talking about there is the soul, not nous. Nous would be what the demiurge does. He says the gods are beyond time, so it all fits, right? But so maybe they could say, well, they've somehow captured both Plato and Aristotle. But I think ultimately they're closer in their conception of thinking to Aristotle than to Plato, which I think is quite interesting and, again, worth a paper in its own right. But I'm going to keep moving on, because now I want to get to what the real point of the paper is, which is the Islamic world. Oh, sorry, some of these Arabic characters don't seem to be showing. So like that little question mark should be a dotted T, but I guess a lot of you won't know Arabic anyway, or the ones who do can figure it out. Okay, so let's now move ahead to the Islamic world, and in particular to my favorite philosopher, Avicenna. So he died in 1037, so he's a long time after Plotinus. Actually, I guess he's approximately as long after Plotinus as Plotinus is after Aristotle. Or yeah, I have to do the math. No, it's even longer. It's an even bigger gap. So we're spanning a long time here. So from Aristotle to Plotinus is like 6 centuries, and now we're going another 8 centuries.
Big gap.
What's that? Big gap. Yes, right. Big gap. Yeah, I don't usually like gaps, but I've only got half an hour here. So, okay. So nonetheless, despite the passage of time here, ironically, we've got a very similar idea to Plotinus when we turn to Avicenna, because Avicenna, again, just like Plotinus, says, well, there's two kinds of thinking. There's discursive thinking. He uses the Arabic word fiqh for that. And then there's intellection, which he calls also simple knowledge, al-ilm al-basit. And he says explicitly that the latter happens without time. So he says, concerning the intellect, when it perceives things among which there are prior and posterior, it necessarily knows time along with them. Yet it does this without being time itself, but in one instant. So his point is, if you think intellectually about something that takes time, then you'll understand that it involves time, but the thinking itself won't involve time, right? The temporality is part of the content of what you grasp, but the kind of phenomenology of thinking, or the activity of thinking, is itself atemporal, doesn't elapse in time. So similarly, he says when you're completing a syllogism, you might in time sort of consider the different steps, but then the moment where you reach the conclusion, and this is where you get the middle term that connects the two premises, that doesn't involve time. So you're discursively thinking about the argument, and then the fruit, the result of the discursive thinking, the end of the inquiry, doesn't require any time. It happens via an, which means in one instant. The word an is like ton nun in Greek, right? It's just an instantaneous, it's not a part of time, it doesn't have any duration. So if you imagine you're like trying to go through an argument, the idea is that the moment where you see how the argument works is just like that. There's no time at all. And as in Plotinus, but even more explicitly, discursive thinking is thought to be a kind of motion. So the word haraka is just the Arabic version for kinesis. And you can see why he might think this, right? So again, go back to the difference between kinesis and energeia. So when you're going through the steps of an argument, that's a lot like taking a journey, right? So you're like taking one step, which is the first premise, and the second premise, and then when you see that the premise is linked together to form the conclusion, then you get your insight, and that's atemporal. Or maybe it's more complicated than that. So maybe, for example, you're using discursive thinking to try to find the middle term of a syllogism. But then when you do get it, wham, you complete the syllogism and you understand what's going on. So the idea would be that thinking is, in a sense, moving and in a sense not. When you're discursively thinking, you're working through something, that's like motion. But then when you understand, you have this flash of insight, that's atemporal. So let me give you an example, which of course has to include giraffes. So here's an actual syllogism. All giraffes are something. All something are herbivores, therefore all giraffes are herbivores. So the idea is we're like giraffe scientists, giraffologists, and we've noticed that giraffes never eat meat. So they only eat plants, and we're trying to understand why. So in an Aristotelian science, you start with the conclusion. The conclusion is what you're trying to explain. And then what you try to do is find a middle term that links the terms of the conclusion, which here is giraffes and herbivores. And then you figure out the middle term is ungulate. So because all ungulates are herbivores, right? I'm not saying this is a great example of a demonstrative syllogism, but it's the one I could come up with. And it involves giraffes, so in that sense, it's a great example. Now, furthermore, Avicenna says that there's this kind of faculty or ability that some people have for grasping these middle terms, and he calls this intuition, or in Arabic, hads. So what you might expect him to say is that when you have these moments of hads, that's an atemporal, non-durational insight that basically fills these gaps in. So now we're filling gaps, Timaeus. And you fill the gap in with the middle term, you complete the syllogism, and bam, you see the explanation for the conclusion. And that would be what scientific progress looks like. And indeed, this is exactly what he says. So in early works, when he's talking about this power of intuition, he says that it happens in a brief time without delay, which of course is based on the passage we saw in Aristotle's posterior analytics, right? The thing about anchinoia, it happens in very little time. But as he's maturing, and here I'm depending on some work by Dimitri Gutas, he comes to think that if we're talking about proper intellection, then we must be talking about something that isn't like motion, because it's not happening in an organ. It's happening in your immaterial rational soul. And so all we've got is a flash of intellection, and that's what intuition is. And so later on, he says, intuition is when the middle term represents itself in the mind all at once without any motion. So this is very explicit that he's distancing the part of thinking where you grasp the middle term, he's distancing that from motion. Whereas when you're thinking, like again, the word here is fikr, so you could say discursively thinking, then you're moving amongst concepts relying on the imagination, seeking the middle term. So again, the picture is you're looking for the middle term, that's motion. Then when you get the middle term, that's not motion, that's just a flash of insight, which takes no time at all. Okay? And although I don't think he actually says this, you could put it in Aristotelian terms by saying that discursive thinking is motion, is kinesis, whereas intellectual thinking is energeia, right? One involves time, one doesn't. One is incomplete while it's going on, like you're working on trying to figure something out, you're not there yet. The other is complete as soon as it's happened. Whenever you have intuition, you already have been having intuition, as Aristotle would put it, right? That grammatical test. So if you ask Avicenna, is science a kind of motion? He would say, well, yes and no. For the most part, it is, because most of science is scientific inquiry. And what you're doing is you're looking for middle terms that will complete syllogisms all the time. Because for him, science is just going to consist entirely of demonstrative syllogisms. So while you're looking for the middle term, and this is of course what you're doing mostly in science, while you're looking for the middle term, what you're doing is a kind of motion. It's discursive. It's not yet complete. And also when you put demonstrative syllogisms together, like linking one to another, that could also be a kind of discursive motion or discursive thinking, which is akin to motion. But the moments where you get the middle terms, which are really the decisive key events in science, those are not motions. Those are motionless and timeless. Another point here is that if we imagine the situation of someone who's a learner rather than an intuitive, very skilled scientist like Avicenna, they might need to be kind of led by the hand through the syllogistic steps, and they're not figuring anything out. They're just being told what the middle terms are. And so for them, the whole thing would be motion. There would be no kind of magic intuition moment. There would just be discursively thinking step by step, right? And that's important because from the point of view of like the reader of a scientific work, what's going on is that you're being led on a journey, which is discursive thinking, moving from one step of a syllogism to the next, from one syllogism to the next, and you're never getting these timeless energeia moments of flashes of insight. Okay, so let's go back to the idea of a journey. Actually, when I told my host in Padua, which is where I gave this paper before, I told her what I was going to be talking about. And remember, the theme of the conference was journeys, right? And she said, yeah, that sounds really interesting, but emotion isn't a journey, right? And it sounds like you just want to talk about motion. But what about journeys? So I thought about that some more, and I thought, well, actually, isn't it interesting that a lot of philosophical works in the Islamic tradition actually, even in their titles, refer to journeys. So for example, there's a work by a philosopher called Suhrawardi, who's in the 12th century, called The Staging Posts. So you can almost imagine like riding a horse and then you stop along the way. And similarly, there's an even later philosopher in the 14th century named Iji, who writes something called the Mawaqif, the stations. So maybe like hopping from one place to the next, right? These are the kind of metaphors we get in titles of works sometimes in the Islamic world. And Suhrawardi also has these kind of allegorical texts where he imagines the soul as something, as a kind of journeying person who goes from one place to the next, right? And you might think, well, okay, well, this is just like a kind of loose metaphor. But these guys knew everything there is to know about Avicenna's epistemology. They didn't know that much about Aristotle, actually, but they knew their Avicenna really well. And so I think that maybe when they thought about philosophy as a kind of journey, what they were imagining is, okay, well, that's because philosophy is some kind of process of discursive thought, especially for the reader of such a work, right? Because as I said, when you're being taught, when you're learning, you're being led by the hand through a discursive process by the master, right? And effectively what would be happening is that you're being led from one syllogism or argument to the next. Actually, it's a further complication here, which I won't get into, but I want to acknowledge it. Something they also talk about, as in Aristotle, is that you begin from things that are familiar to you and work to the principles, and then you go from the principles back down, right? So this is sort of U-shaped thing that we get in ancient philosophy. They have the same idea, and that whole thing would be the kind of shape of the motion, right? So you would journey through maybe induction or something like that up to the principles, and then you would journey through the syllogisms back down. That would be like the perfect scientific journey. It's not so clear how that would be reflected in the actual writing. So when you're writing, you might be only trying to get the person to the principles, or you might start with the principles and go down, or you might do the whole U-shaped trip. So that might differ from one work to another. But anytime you're describing any part of that, it would make sense to use metaphors of motion and journeying to describe it. And that made me think, and now we're like really getting further in history. So now we're up to the 17th century, because this is, I wanted to finish by saying something about an early modern philosopher from Iran named Mulla Sadra, who's a very famous thinker in the Islamic tradition and still a very influential thinker in Iran. And he wrote a lot, but his most famous work is called The Four Journeys. The word for journeys is asfar. And it's this very complicated, long, I mean, the edition is several volumes long, right? So it's big work, but the overarching metaphor of the entire work is journeys. And there's supposed to be four journeys. There's a paper by Rudiger Ansen where he tries to figure out where the journeys start and stop and what they are. And he decides that it's very complicated, but he has a kind of story about trying to identify what the journeys are. But I'm not really concerned with that. My question is, why does he use the metaphor of a journey for this huge philosophical treatise? And here there's a usual story about it, which is that the journey is a metaphor that was often used by Islamic mystics, like Sufis. So like the journey to God, right? And you can maybe think of Bonaventure here from the Latin tradition. So he wrote something called The Journey of the Mind to God, also a fairly mystical text. So that's maybe comparable. And in fact, Mulla Sadra was very strongly influenced by Sufism. Actually, Hani Mohseni, who's here, has worked on this tradition, this philosophical Sufi tradition. So he might have something to say about this as well. But anyway, this is, I guess, what people usually think is going on. This is the reason why people think that the Asfar is called that, why it's called the Four Journeys. And I don't really want to deny that, but I want to suggest a kind of complementary idea, which is that journeys are, or the journey is a way of describing an epistemic process in post-Avicenna philosophy because of everything I've said in this talk. So actually, as Ansen himself says in his article about the journeys in Sadra, that he says Sadra's concept of journeys refers to an epistemic process, which starts both from principles of conceptual cognition and principles of demonstration, and progresses upward on the basis of verifiable judgments and epidictic proofs. In other words, Sadra is moving through the sciences, and he's saying, well, like you can sort of arrange metaphysics and philosophical theology and physics, and these are all journeys. That seems to be the basic idea. And in each case, in each journey, what you're doing is putting proofs together in the way I was describing before. And what's really interesting is that in the passage that Ansen quotes in his article, Sadra actually connects this whole epistemic process to motion, which is exactly what you'd expect him to do if he was thinking about everything I've been talking about. So he says, you have now risen above the disposition above which you were created and to which you have been assigned. You've discovered the horizon which borders on your own horizon, puts you in motion and makes you move forward from one level to the next. So that's what's happening where you're going through Sadra's philosophy. So I think that what this shows is that the idea of thinking as a kind of motion has sort of basically survived from Plato all the way to 17th century Iranian philosophy with qualifications, right? Because now it's not that all thinking is motion, it's only discursive thinking. It's understood in this very Aristotelianized way in terms of a scientific progress. Maybe in Sadra, that this is a kind of a complicated thing, but Sadra also has this anti-Aristotelian idea that there can be motion in respect of substances as well as accidents. So he gives examples like when an animal is maturing from being a baby to a mature animal, the substance is actually moving in the sense of changing into something complete. And he might also think that the progress of coming to have knowledge is like a substantial motion in the soul. That might be another reason why he calls it motion. But that would just complement the same idea that we've seen in Avicenna, that discursive thinking and moving through the sciences is a kind of motion that involves occasional flashes of insight, which are not motions, right? So this weird idea that we started with of thinking is motion, is like spinning in your head, is comparable to the spinning of the heavens. Actually, I mean, I guess I probably haven't convinced you that it's not a weird idea. I guess it kind of is a weird idea, but it's an idea that has an incredibly long afterlife. So that we're, like I said, we're in the 17th century. So we've just spanned about 2,000 years of philosophy here, a little bit more even. And we've still got the same idea of thinking as a motion hanging on in this early modern Islamic thinker, which I think is interesting. And worthy of reflection on our own right. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation and talk, and especially during this period of having so many philosophies of mind and intelligence and questions about consciousness and all this, not only from the technological perspective, but also from psychology and other fields. I think it's very interesting to see different perspectives of what means intelligence, what means cognition, as you describe different forms of thought and perspective. But there might be some questions from the audience. We have maybe 15 to 20 minutes for questions. So, Dori, I think you want to have a question.
Yes, thank you, Peter. Thank you very much. I was wondering, the claim that the conclusion doesn't take any time, and possibly even more broadly, the claim about thinking as a journey, are these ontological claims? Or what kind of claims, what kind of arguments are they? The proofs about them, what type of arguments are they?
That's a good question. So I guess they're at least ontological claims, because at least in Avicenna, part of the idea would be that the reason why intuition doesn't take time and discursive thinking does is that discursive thinking is happening in your brain. So it's in some sense, a physical process, whereas intuitive thinking is a non-physical process.
I see. That's very interesting. Yeah.
Right. So I think it's a lot less clear in Plato or Aristotle what it would amount to, because they don't link that. So, for example, Aristotle doesn't link the seeing or the kinesis energeia distinction to some kind of ontological contrast. So, for example, and you can see that in the fact that seeing is apparently a physical process, but it still counts as an energeia, right? So it doesn't look like the energeia kinesis distinction is somehow supposed to track some kind of ontological contrast.
The way I understand Aristotle is that he gives a semantic argument to reach an ontological conclusion, because his conception is that thinking is an energeia, seeing, let's say, is an energeia, but his argument for it, you have seen, seems to me to be a semantic argument. I don't think that's an ontological argument, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, so the what he's appealing to, so you mean like the test of like you have seen whenever you see, yeah. I think that's right, but I don't know that the grammatical argument or the semantic argument is supposed to be constitutive of the distinction. It's just supposed to help you tell the difference, right? So it's sort of symptomatic, right? So I think the real difference is whether it's complete or not whenever it's being done, right? And the semantic point about the perfect tense is just to help you see the point about completeness. Now, whether completeness is an ontological notion is not so clear to me. I mean, I guess
we don't have to get into that. We don't have to get into that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I mean, but yeah, but I think that certainly once you get to the Neoplatonists and Avicenna, it's heavily ontological, because they even would say, well, discursive thinking happens at the soul, noesis happens in nous, and these are completely different entities. Right.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Dori. And there is another question from Mr. Mosenigami.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your talk, Peter. That was really interesting.
Good to see you. You're in California, right?
Yeah, it's morning right now here.
Yeah. Good morning.
Good evening. So my question also pertains to Avicenna's claim that reaching a conclusion is an atemporal process, or something that happens in an instant. So, I mean, yeah, so in your talk, you mentioned that in part this claim is motivated by his ontology, namely that the rational zone is immaterial, so it cannot be in motion, which presupposes materiality. So I was wondering, is there maybe also another motivation here? So I was thinking of Lewis Carroll's What the Tortoise Said to Achilles, when you talked about this atemporal kind of thinking. So if we suppose that reaching a conclusion is just another step, then we might get into these paradoxes where, in order to, let's say, accept a simple modus ponens argument, where if P is Q, P is the case, therefore Q, we need to suppose another principle, namely that if P then Q is true, and if P is true, then Q follows, and if we want that, then we need to suppose another principle, and so on. And that seems to be a result of accepting the view that going from premises to a conclusion is also an additional step. But if we postulate another kind of thinking that is not emotion, or it's not another additional step, but it happens in an instant, then it seems that we can avoid this problem. So I'm aware that Fakhreddin Razi, I think, also discusses these issues. But I'm not sure if Avicenna. But I'm not sure if Avicenna does, or if he's aware of this. And so I was just wondering.
It's really smart. Yeah, it's a really good point. So actually, it seems like the person who really formulates the Carroll's paradox is in the Islamic tradition is, I guess, Razi. It's also in Khulaji. So these logicians in the post-Avicenna period, and actually a postdoc here named Dustin Klinger has just written a paper about that, which I think isn't out yet. That's a really good point, that you might want to use this distinction to solve Carroll's paradox. I don't know of any evidence that Avicenna had thought about that, though, the paradox. And I think for him, it's more a matter of whether you can divide something into parts, right? So if you think about like moving through a science, right? You're kind of going from one bit to the next, and that's a lot like spatial movement, where you're covering 1 meter and then another meter and then another meter, or 1 mile and another mile, right? So I think it's more an issue of like, is it susceptible to division that would make him think that it was temporal and counts as motion? Of course, and again, here we have another reason to think that intellection shouldn't be motion, because he makes a big deal about the fact that the intelligible has to be undivided, right? That's in fact part of his proof for the immateriality of soul.
Yeah.
Thanks, that's really helpful, actually. I might put something about that in the paper. That's really good. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And Dimitri, yes, please.
Yes, so thank you very much, Peter. Perhaps a related remark. So about Avicenna, whom I don't know, actually, from my studies, but in any case, I think it seems that it is interesting that time and perhaps, let's say, eternity here is a kind of subjective thing. So it is interesting for me that one can read the conclusion and being in this process of being in time, whereas another person can just see the conclusion and be in this kind of instant, so above time. So could we say that that in this discussion we can see, let's say, two modalities of thinking? So this kind of discursive thinking and just this instance of this kind of noetic thinking.
Yeah, didn't you write a paper about this at King's College? Like, I don't know, it must have been like 15 years ago when we were both there. You wrote a paper.
Exactly, yes, that was my my second paper, yes.
A lot of time has passed since then. So, I mean, that must have been like 2009 or something.
Yes,
Okay.
yes,
We've known each
exactly.
other for a long time. Okay, so yes. So, I mean, I think first of all, that's a very tricky question, whether in fact time is subjective. So people talk about this a lot in respect of Aristotle, right? So remember, he says this thing about if there were no soul, there would be no time. And sometimes people think that means that time is somehow created by the subjective perception of things happening, right? Which would mean that time was kind of mind dependent, right? You get a similar idea in Augustine, maybe. But I think that in the Platonist tradition, actually, that's really not going to work, because the soul's discursive thinking actually produces the time, which also governs things like physical processes, right? So they would say that, so sometimes, like in Aristotle, you also get the suggestion that time is somehow generated by heavenly motion. And you could take that lesson from the Timaeus as well. But from in the Neoplatonists, it really seems to be that time is generated by the soul, the hypostasis of soul, or the world soul, maybe, thinking. And the time that makes is clearly, in some sense, like objectively real, because it's what allows physical events to happen in time, right? So in a way, whereas Aristotle might be saying, well, you got these events and then you measure them with your mind, and then time happens and it's subjective. In the Platonists, it's the other way around. You start with a soul that's thinking temporally, and then that creates the conditions for events, right? So one way of putting this is like, in Plotinus's universe, why isn't everything all happening at once? Why are things spread out in time as well as in place? And the answer is because soul is thinking, because that generates time, and because time is extended and has parts. You can then have something like a spatial motion, like the motion of Mars or something around the sun, is taking up a certain amount of time, right? An extension of time, which is subordinated to the psychic time. So I think that that from the point of view of soul itself, you could maybe say that it's subjective because it sort of belongs to the phenomenology of discursive thought. But on the other hand, it's as objective as anything in Plotinus's system, because it creates an external, like what we would think of as a, externally real phenomenon which governs physics, right? Then there's further questions about how time relates to eternity, but maybe we don't need to get into that.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Thank you, Dimitri. And yes, Yorgo, please.
Yeah, thank you, Peter, for your wonderful presentation. I would like to ask you if you could say something more about revelation or illumination, which is another source of knowledge, according to some of the authors you mentioned.
Yeah, that's a great question. So it depends on whose perspective you're talking about. So if you're thinking
Especially
about it,
the Platonists of the gang.
yeah. Yeah, so what they would say is, so someone like Suravadi or even Avicenna, Farabi, what they would say is that the prophets when they get their revelation, what's happening is that these celestial principles are revealing to them what philosophers get in moments of intuition, roughly, right? And maybe they get it all at once, or they get a lot of it at once, right? So from their point of view, from the point of view of the prophet, you might say that revelation is a moment of energeia, right? But for everyone else, the revelation is presented in some kind of symbolic or linguistic form, or both actually. It's a linguistic form that is allegorical and symbolic and rhetorical. This is a point that Farabi really makes very strongly, and also Averroes. So from our point of view, the content of the revelation is discursive. And it's not even scientific, actually. It's much more like hearing a convincing speech or seeing a nice movie or something that would convince you of something, right? But for the prophet, it would be more like Avicenna intuition. So they are privileged by having this kind of special connection to God or to a celestial intellect, which would be an angel. So actually, in Islam, the Quran is revealed to Muhammad by an angel, by Gabriel. And these philosophers thought that that was basically a code word for the active intellect that was actualizing the prophet's rational soul with the full content of the knowledge needed to run the Islamic society, if not all knowledge that there is. And so so the prophet is doing something very much like what the philosopher is doing, but the rest of us just get it in some kind of mediated form that's like, it's in the form of poetry, it's memorable, it's got images and so on. So it's not the same thing as what so I mean, from their point of view, what Muhammad gets is not primarily the words of the Quran, which I think actually is what most Muslims believe. So what Muslims believe generally is that the angel said, recite this, and then he got some words, right? Some poetry. Whereas the philosophers think that what he got was some understanding, which he then presented in poetic form for the masses, as they say. So it's a very elitist picture where the philosophers are the people who are most like the prophet.
Thank you very much, Peter and Yorgos. Peter, I would like to ask, perhaps if there is no other questions, maybe a final one, because we are running out of time again. And it was very interesting for me, this reference to intuition in Avicenna's thought and this middle term, as you said. So in Plotinus, who was mentioned several times today, we have this meson, this middle region of the soul between this perceptible and the higher intelligible part, where it's related to antellipsis, to the conscious apprehension of things. And of course, it's an open issue and a discussion. I wonder if there might be a connection between what this intuition as a middle term and this middle region of the soul could be related somehow, because this idea of the journey between the discursive and the non-discursive element seems to be a transition and not something that happens completely immediately, which is a very important, I think, so for the Neoplatonists. But I'm not sure if there might be connection with Avicenna or the Arabic tradition in this case.
It's an interesting idea. I mean, so this idea that the soul is a meson between like nature and nous, for example. You also get in Ficino. So Ficino is a really good example of this, right? So he thinks there's 5 levels and the soul is in the middle. And to get that, he says there's God, which is the one, angel, which is nous, soul, and then to make sure that soul is in the middle, he says there's quality and bodies. So he distinguishes these to get 5, so that soul can be the meson.
The meson, yes.
And the same word is used for the middle term, tomeson. So that's true. I think the thing that's giving me pause, though, is that I don't think you want to say that the middle term in a syllogism is playing a role like the meson in Neoplatonic metaphysics. So if you think about also like, well, actually, no, now I'm having second thoughts. So I was going to say in the Iamblichus, you've got the idea that between any two principles, there will be an intermediating principle. So like between the intelligible gods and the intellecting gods, there will be gods that are both intelligible and intellecting. That's one of my favorite examples, right? And I was going to say that that doesn't really sound like the middle term of an Aristotelian syllogism. But then I had a thought that gives me pause, which is that the middle term in an Aristotelian syllogism is supposed to be causal, right? So it's not just anything that the extreme terms have in common. If it's a demonstrative syllogism, it has to be the reason that the minor term or that the major term belongs to the minor term, right? So the reason why being a herbivore belongs to giraffe is that the giraffe is an ungulate, right? It's the explanation, it's the cause, right? And middle terms in Neoplatonism are also causal, right? So the hierarchy is always such that the mediating thing sort of joins together the higher and the lower, and is a means by which the efficacy of the higher is passed on to the lower. So it has that. So we have the fact that the same Greek word is involved, and we have the fact that in both cases we have a causal connection. I think what we need is a text where someone actually brought that together and said, oh yeah, like the middle term of a syllogism is an example of an Iamblichian mean term. So, certainly that's not an Avicenna, but I wouldn't be surprised if you could find it in some Neoplatonist. So that's homework for everybody. Whoever finds that gets €5.
Peter, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation.
Good to see some old friends.
Yes, and thank you. That was great because we had these technical problems in the beginning, but now everything was solved immediately. And it's so nice to see you all, and very good friends and scholars. And thank you all for the honor for being here tonight with us. And very best wishes for the Christmas holidays. And thank you once again. Thank you once again. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye. Have a good night.
Bye. 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 Bye.